Welcome to a look beyond the big three, the role and importance of alternative cloud providers. I'm your host, Eric Norlin, and I have two great guests with us today. We have Liam Eagle from 451 Research and KellyAnn Fitzpatrick from Redmonk. The format for today is pretty easy. We're going to do two really short presentations from each of our guests and then dive right into a discussion about what we just saw and heard and the state of the alternative cloud provider market in general. So enough of me blathering on. I'll get out of the way and throw it over to you, Liam.
All right. Thank you, Eric. And hi, everyone. I am Liam Eagle. I'm a research director at 451 Research, part of S&P Global Market Intelligence. I lead our Voice of the Enterprise and Voice of the Service Provider survey practices, and I'm a contributor to our cloud and managed services transformation channel. So I'm going to be sharing some ideas that are kind of born out of our survey research and also out of our sort of cloud coverage. I'll be starting sort of today's session off with a bit of a conceptual look at this idea of alternative cloud. What should we be thinking about as sort of observers or customers when we consider the alternative cloud? How do we identify it? How do we evaluate it? Who's it for? As Eric mentioned, this is meant to be a pretty short session, so I'm going to be moving pretty quickly through this presentation. So let's get right into it. I guess before we get to the alternative, I wanted to begin with this idea of the context, or the context that would create the need for an alternative, or the need for the idea of an alternative in the first place. The context, of course, is that public cloud is a market that is overwhelmingly dominated by a handful of hyperscale vendors. This slide, the data is from our Market Monitor service, which is our sort of market sizing and forecasting instrument. We estimate that just the infrastructure as a service market was a $24 billion market in 2019. However, the largest 5 vendors account for more than 70% of that revenue. So the consequence of this is that these vendors dominate the conversation. They define the expectations for the market in terms of what they do with their services and what they do with their approaches. As an analyst, as a researcher, we run the risk of not paying full attention to the other companies that may be succeeding or maybe innovating in this space, creating interesting alternatives to those hyperscalers. And this is a challenge that customers face as well, just sort of being distracted by the sort of the prominence of the market leaders. So as we begin to sort of think about defining an alternative, I think it's interesting to start with thinking about, why are we defining what we mean by alternative cloud? So it's kind of tempting to define the alternative according to what it is not, right? It is not one of the handful of hyperscale public cloud vendors. And this is, technically true. It doesn't really capture the fact that, a business is likely to be looking for a credible alternative to public cloud. And if we don't set some kind of bar for narrowing the scope of what we're talking about, it's a distinction that includes almost everything else, including hundreds or thousands of other service providers, which isn't really much of a distinction at all. So, let's focus here on setting the bar that a vendor has to clear in order to be considered one of those sort of credible alternatives to the public cloud. Obviously, the requirements are going to vary on the, on the individual customer basis, but hopefully, the basics are kind of the same across the alternatives. So let's start thinking about, a definition here. And now I should be clear that, at 451 Research, we haven't really developed a formal definition for alternative cloud for a couple of reasons. But right now we treat the idea alternative cloud more as sort of an interesting idea in a topic area than sort of a formal market category. However, it is helpful to know what we're talking about. So I think first off, we should think about the core cloud function. Basically, it meets that definition for, is it cloud infrastructure with distinct, resources for compute and storage. It has a couple other key core functions like load balancing or DNS. The service should be built on a quality of components that is, roughly comparable to the leading cloud vendors. It shouldn't be sort of a great departure in terms of what it's built on. It should definitely have, APIs for programmatic provisioning and for operation. I mean, that's part of that sort of definition of a cloud aspect. It should have, it should be comparable in terms of SLAs to what you would expect from the leading clouds. It should probably have a footprint that makes it more than just a very specific regional offering. It should have the sort of capability to deliver compliance with, the sort of standard regulatory and security requirements that a customer is likely to have. And so that's not, an exhaustive list. And certainly I'm not trying to create an exhaustive list here, but, and in fact, I would expect that the sort of whatever bar we set is going to continue to rise over time. But it gives you a sense of how we can sort of narrow that lens down so that we're talking about dozens of companies rather than hundreds or thousands of companies. So who is this alternative cloud for? Well, I think part of the idea of an alternative cloud is that you're capturing many of the same benefits as are being proposed by the big brands, which is to say, the benefits of cloud. In our surveys and in our conversations that we have with businesses that include, SMBs and some larger companies, those tend to be some combination of agility, performance, availability, cost, security, improvements to those things. And then, we can look for some additional areas in which, the alternative providers may tend to offer, kind of addition by subtraction. So there may be a benefit in the greater simplicity of the offerings or the simplicity of the interface or the structure, the simplicity of the billing, or just an overall sense of sort of ease of use. There's also likely to be, kind of a softer learning curve with a service like that. So, the sort of time from starting out on the platform to being able to accomplish the things that you want to do with it should be shorter. And then finally, there are some examples of areas in which the alternatives might actually offer more than the hyperscalers or the bigger vendors in terms of capability. So for instance, they may have a sort of higher level of management or customer support that's bundled along with the infrastructure, which isn't really how the hyperscalers operate. So as we think about the kind of organizations that might benefit most from an alternative cloud, let's talk a little bit more about that idea of simplicity being a benefit. I think as a baseline, I would say, as a baseline to who's going to benefit from using the alternative cloud, I would say that most companies that are developing, or operating applications, which is most companies, stand to benefit from using cloud, right? However, we pretty consistently see that access to the skill sets that you need to execute effectively on clouds has become a really key, roadblock or hurdle that a lot of organizations are facing. And that is made, I think, more intense by the fact that, hyperscalers tend to, hold that pace of innovation and the rate with which they roll out new features and functions to be sort of a key part of the value that they propose. So I think a company would benefit if it understands the potential benefits of using a cloud platform and sort of desires those benefits, but also doesn't have the expertise or the desire to work with the most complex tools that are available. And so the businesses that are going to benefit most from the alternatives are the ones that will actually see value in the simplicity of the platform. That are, these are frequently going to be SMBs or small businesses, but it's not exclusively these businesses. So the term alternative, in a way, it kind of suggests that we're talking about instead of, right? But I think it's useful to also kind of think about how could the alternative be kind of a complementary piece of a more diverse portfolio, right? So in our surveys that we conduct, we see more and more organizations telling us they're intentionally using multiple different public cloud vendors. As you can see on the chart here, it's for a variety of reasons that includes, access to key features of the various platforms that they're accessing on a case-by-case basis. So for a lot of the reasons that we discussed, cost, simplicity, ease of use, and the idea that each of those things may be a sort of key feature of the alternative clouds, there may be a role for the alternatives to play in that sort of larger cloud portfolio of a company with a multi-cloud approach to consuming these resources. It may be useful for an application that benefits from a straightforward platform, or it may be a good resource for a group within a large organization that isn't necessarily, equipped to manage the type of resources that they might expect from a hyperscaler. But, the sort of role of the alternative can also be, one tool in the toolbox for some of the larger organizations. So in the interest of time, I haven't really sort of put together a lot of big concluding slides for you here, but I did want to say, if anyone wants to reach out to me, feel free to contact to me using the info on the slide. And thanks for joining, and thanks for listening to my part of the presentation. I won't linger on this disclaimer slide here, but aside from saying, please don't take anything that I've said to be investment advice. So, Eric?
Liam is not a financial professional. Thank you, Liam. All right, for a look at the developer side of things, let's kick it over to you, KellyAnn. It's all yours.
Sweet, thank you. And Liam, thank you for that kind of great, short and economical bit of information. There's like so much good stuff in there. I can't wait to kind of talk about it in a bit. So as Eric noted, you'll be hearing a lot more about kind of the role that cloud plays specifically for developers. And of course, we're looking at alternative clouds specifically. My name is KellyAnn Fitzpatrick. I am an analyst at Redmonk, which is the developer-focused industry analyst firm. In a previous life, I also worked as a test and release manager and a tech writer. And I also taught computer science majors at Georgia Tech. So I've spent a lot of time around once and future developers. And that certainly hasn't changed since I joined Redmonk, because developers and practitioners more broadly are our focus. We've been around since 2002, but in 2013, one of our co-founders, Steve O'Grady, wrote a book called The New Kingmakers: How Developers Kind of Conquered the World. And his premise there is that more and more developer-led adoption, or what we often will call kind of bottom-up adoption, is we're seeing that more and more in the industry, in that developers have more of a say in the kind of tools and technologies that they are using at work to build software. So that's certainly definitely a focus for us. And kind of one of the premises that we have is that developers don't have to ask permission like they used to in order to use those kind of tools and technologies that they want. One of the reasons for this has been the rise of, say, like open source software. So think about it, you no longer have to go through procurement in order to use a particular tool if it's something that you can kind of just get and use. And that's been around for quite a while. And also this kind of led to a bit of a disconnect between what developers were using to kind of build software and what their bosses thought they were kind of using. So there's certainly a lot that to kind of think through there regarding open source software. But this is something that has become probably even more prominent with the introduction of cloud, specifically kind of public cloud options, and the kind of self-service offerings that they kind of bring. Not only do developers not need to kind of ask permission anymore to get kind of the tools that they want to use, but they no longer have to ask permission in order to get the infrastructure that they used to use. And if you have kind of worked in the software industry before public cloud was a thing, you're probably very familiar with the process of having to find somebody in IT, going through the mysteries of who it is you need to find, the mysteries of the process to kind of get just even a server provisioned. And public cloud very much has not removed that entirely, because there are still places where that is how the process works. And academic institutions are often one of them. But it has provided an option where you no longer have to wait for IT or even talk to them. And if you're like me, and many developers I know, you don't really want to talk to someone in order to get what you need. And you can provision your IT when you need it. You can do it quickly, and you can do it with a credit card, or better yet, your boss's credit card. And in many ways, when this first became a thing, it was before we all knew what would happen when you turn things on and forget to turn them off and got that surprise credit card bill. So especially at first, cloud had this, a kind of amazingly wonderful promise that is kind of still there, but has certainly evolved over time. And one thing that cloud has done for developers has allowed them to get back to the business of writing code and or kind of curating kit and memes, so like very important things that developers need to be doing. Because cloud is so prolific and kind of ubiquitous now, it's easy to forget that at one point cloud was still very much an alternative to what was then the established way of kind of doing software development, whether you were an individual developer who was working on a side project or on a development team at a business of some size. And, in many ways, like alternative music before the 1990s, cloud was an option that was different from the kind of mainstream way of doing things. And, to the point where Liam and Eric and I earlier were talking about how back in the day, anytime you went to a tech conference, people were still trying to figure out how do you define cloud. And we don't really have to do that so much anymore, thank goodness. So, kind of moving on, cloud is no longer really seen as an alternative, but much like alternative music after it went through the 90s, it has become one of the mainstream options, for doing software development. And there used to be an old phrase, or it's not even an old phrase, it's still probably around, nobody gets fired for buying IBM. The new version of that is nobody gets fired for buying AWS. So cloud has gone from an alternative to something that is just one of the many kind of options that people have. And, even more so to kind of going into it is, for some folks, the dominant option of where they go to, get what they need in order to build software. Not only has cloud become mainstream, but we now have terms like cloud computing and cloud native. Cloud native is one that I think we do still talk about a bit. Often people use this as kind of a shorthand to just talk about containers, but I think had that term even before containers were around. So depends on how you actually kind of look at the term. But with kind of cloud native computing, we even had the kind of different ways of doing things. Cloud computing and container specifically has promised more portability, more consistency. The term "it works on my machine," which I as a test and release manager heard so often, is one that kind of cloud computing and kind of cloud native architectures is somewhat promised to help us eradicate, although it certainly hasn't quite done that yet. And in addition, cloud has introduced increasingly more abstract ways of kind of approaching software development. With the rise of things like managed services and SaaS offerings, folks no longer not only do you not have to worry really about your infrastructure, you don't even have to worry about building out something like authorization and authentication. There's usually an offering out there that you can kind of get from a SaaS or cloud vendor to kind of plug it in there, which are all good things. As we can not have to spend so much time building out all of these different kind of pieces that we don't necessarily need, developers can focus more and more on the code that matters to them, to actually building things and using their time and expertise much more efficiently. So one of the kind of results of all of these evolutions in cloud and public cloud options is that for some people, cloud has become overwhelming. Developers are spoiled for choice. My colleague, Steve O'Grady, has actually called this kind of like a golden age for developers in terms of all the options they have. But at the same time, they are also burdened by choice. And that can almost be paralyzing in a way if you are especially a developer trying to figure out how to start navigating all of these different, kind of public cloud options. Even more so because as individual developers and kind of smaller teams are trying to figure out how to get the stuff that they need, they're often competing with much larger organizations for the attention of public cloud vendors. So it can be really difficult to kind of get the pricing that they need, often the kind of support that they need, and sometimes even the just supporting tools, that they need to do what they need to do. And this is where alternative cloud as a category or as a concept, maybe it's not even a category yet, maybe we're still at the concept stage, kind of comes in, that it is an option. It is a different way of doing, kind of more mainstream way of doing cloud computing. And while Liam has kind of covered a lot of the advantages for organizations, it's probably worth talking about what this means for developers. And for developers who do not need, say, a Cheesecake Factory menu of items to kind of choose from their public cloud provider, alternative cloud providers are a really strong and viable option, especially if they are working in an organization that is going for that kind of multi-cloud approach. So you can kind of stitch together the pieces that you need from different folks. On the flip side, alternative cloud providers are very well positioned to kind of serve developers in ways that hyperscalers cannot. you as a developer can get what you need quickly with your credit card, or again, hopefully your boss's credit card. And you can get support in ways that you probably cannot, at least not as quickly, from hyperscalers. More importantly, you can get whatever kind of on-ramping materials that you need. And I think Liam described alternative cloud providers as being able to offer a softer on-ramp, which I think is a really good way to think about it. And in terms of things like documentation, not only getting the documentation you need, but knowing that it is up to date and that you can find it and that it is not lost in what is often called doc sprawl, which is what we kind of see happen. And this is not to kind of rip on any of the hyperscalers, because as someone who has done documentation, doc sprawl is hard to wrangle. It's hard to prevent. It's actually a thing. So alternative cloud is yet another way that developers can kind of get back to what they would rather be doing, which is, kind of writing code or curating their kitten memes. But it's a way of doing it now that, unlike when cloud, kind of started, does offer, a lot of the other things that they need. It's not just compute and storage anymore. There's all the other things that kind of get packaged up with it and can really give developers the kind of experience that they need to build the code and build the things that they want. And with that, I'm going to just turn it back over to you, Eric.
All right. Thank you, KellyAnn. So as I listen to the two presentations, it seems to me that we're looking at a similar market segment, alternative cloud, through two lenses, right? There's the lens of the organizational lens that's saying we have kind of the hyperscalers, which would be the Pelotons and Netflixes and Zooms, and I mean the customers of hyperscalers, right? Peloton, Netflix, Zoom, the folks that are working in millions and millions of concurrent transactions or connections at one point in time. Where alternative cloud would be the segment of the market below that, where you're looking for similar technical performance, perhaps better pricing, but not necessarily the almost overwhelming raft of 17,000 features rolled out every year at an annual conference, right? So from an organizational standpoint, you have that lens. And then from the other lens, from what KellyAnn was talking about, kind of the developer enthusiast. So you have the kind of a Venn diagram of small, medium, perhaps large-sized businesses and developer enthusiasts overlapping. And I think it's interesting that the phrase that Liam brought up around that is simplicity, not in the sense of it being basic or underdeveloped, but simplicity in the sense of ease of use and the on-ramp towards that ease of use. Kelly, could you maybe address kind of the organizational component, and then Liam, I'll ask you to address the developer side of things, and we can kind of cross the two in that Venn diagram? I'll let you go first, KellyAnn. Sorry.
So like in terms of organizational component, which I don't know if it's completely separate from developers, because again, one of the things that we've seen is that developers do have a certain degree of influence in the technology that does get used kind of in their organizations. So any time that you have that kind of speed, that decreased time to productivity is probably or velocity is probably the term that transcends both the organizational side of things and the individual developer sides of things, that everybody can agree that speed, when done well, is good. I think that's where that applies. And, kind of going back to one of the things that Liam had mentioned, is there is often this kind of technology skills gap in terms of the technologies that folks are comfortable using and the technologies that they need to use to be most productive, to either do what they want for their pet projects or to, do what they need to in order to kind of do their job. And anything that can help close that skills gap, that can help, make the project of getting code written easier to do and kind of more accessible, that is a good thing for everybody.
Liam?
Yeah, so I think one thing I might add there is that the sort of value of simplicity. So when we ask folks, what's the sort of number one objective when you're consuming cloud infrastructure, and I think what's implied in that question is consuming cloud infrastructure as opposed to putting something on a server in your own data center or some other way of operating other than cloud, is that they're the ahead of cost and ahead of performance and ahead of security and all that is sort of the business agility idea, right? And so they want to be able to do things quickly, and they want to be able to change things quickly. And so I think that, the sort of to KellyAnn's point, the learning curve to become proficient with a platform is a huge factor in that agility, right? It's sort of, if it takes you 6 months to sort of figure it all out, and then also takes 30% of your time to just keep up to date with the platform going forward, it's a little bit of a hindrance to agility in a sense that's sort of separated from the platform, right?
Right. So it's not simply a product feature pricing problem, right? It's a not having to devote what in essence becomes technical debt for an organization just to keep up with product and features and benefits being rolled out at a clip that's almost unbelievable.
Yeah. And then maybe
right?
one other thing to throw. Yeah. And one other thing to throw in there that's maybe interesting is that, I think, the idea that KellyAnn presented around this sort of idea of developers being the kingmakers and developers being the function that's really making the decisions about platforms at a lot of organizations is that, one of the things that simplicity also offers is that, there are all kinds of reasons why a developer would choose something that is sort of, appealingly simple, but it also allows for you don't need to be, super advanced to do something simple with a platform. So if an organization has a small team that's doing, some kind of marketing site or something like that, right? If a large organization is building some kind of marketing effort and it's just a fairly simple website, it's not a really complex application. There might be opportunities for teams that aren't, super sophisticated in terms of operating the platform to do things themselves without the involvement of, your best engineers.
Yeah, and I like this idea of thinking of kind of simple, not as something that is opposed to, say, unsophisticated, or not as unsophisticated, and not something that's opposed to like complexity, but as opposed to more like complication and red tape and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Simple as well. That's exactly right. I was thinking while you're talking about how we've kind of come from, and this is an old guy thing, right? So like it used to be that you actually got software in the mail and it was on a disk and you installed it, and
they would send you the disks, lots and lots of them.
Yeah, I was a VP of marketing. I remember like we spent large portions of time designing the packaging for the disk, and it was a big deal. And we got rid of all of that, thankfully. But it also speaks to kind of the transition we've had in the business world, where this huge segment of the American economy, the small, mid-sized business, or even the worldwide economy, was operating either on paper or in these siloed applications of software where they were updating just that specific type of software. And we've now moved to a realm where these small to mid-sized businesses have moved beyond running Dropbox or Google Docs or these types of siloed applications and are starting to string together and build their own internal applications. And that's where the alternative cloud market starts to really make sense for them, right? They're not simply just buying applications. They're building their own internal infrastructure to achieve certain goals. Is that right, KellyAnn?
And I don't know if I would say their own internal infrastructure in terms of like the physical
No, but they're buying cloud infrastructure to do that, right?
Absolutely. In terms of the infrastructure for how they're actually going about their business. I think that's a really a good way to look at it. It's no longer having little pieces everywhere. Although I would argue that I would caution us against saying that all organizations are falling in this one kind of way of doing things. I think there are still folks who are kind of in the world of having those things siloed, and they're still looking to get away from that and to the point where they almost are having this more kind of integrated and functional kind of platform that folks are using. So I would say we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and assume that everybody is already there. A lot of folks are looking to get to that point.
That's interesting. So so my mistake, when I say building infrastructure, what I mean is buying virtualized infrastructure that you don't own or build, right? So Liam, to KellyAnn's point, if we're just now starting to talk about the category of alternative cloud providers, that speaks to the fact that we're just at the beginning of this, right? There's a monstrous wave of adoption in front of us from that standpoint.
Well, I mean, so it's interesting, right? I mean, if you hold it's I sort of started out by saying, you know, if you think about, you know, the sort of top 2 or 3 public cloud vendors, you know, the significance that they hold in kind of the public discourse and so forth can kind of dismiss what can sort of lead to dismissing what the other vendors, the many other vendors in the space are doing. And on the other hand, like, you know, a $100 million, $200 million business only really looks small if you hold it up next to, you know, a 10 or $20 billion business, right? So
Right.
I think that there's lots of opportunity for alternative clouds to do interesting things and grow and have success. And I think we are seeing a lot more consumption. Like, to your point, I mean, you know, I think a lot of businesses that, you know, have previously, you know, not to diminish the value of SaaS at all, but to say that, you know, SaaS has been their only approach to putting things outside, you know, or to consuming software. And that way is to say, oh, you know, there maybe the bar for us to do something custom or to take something open source and sort of tweak it to our needs, or to, you know, to look for ways to sort of put our data in places that, like, or a business that maybe never would have thought about collecting and analyzing data about its business in the past is starting to do that. So yeah, I think there's all kinds of appetite for coming forward in the future, that for which, and for a portion of that, you know, simplicity is going to be a value proposition. You know, a simpler and maybe a smaller cost is going to be a value proposition. So yeah, I think there's probably lots of opportunity for the alternatives in the future. And then the other thing, I think, when you're trying to define a category is, you know, and one of the reasons I think that we've sort of struggled to clearly just sort of assign a market category to this is that, you know, there's a lot of service providers out there that do something else and also kind of do a version of this, right? And so there's a kind of a question of, and for us, it's also just a challenge in how do you count that, right? But, you know, there's a lot of, you know, telcos or web hosting companies or, you know, probably SaaS companies. There's a lot of different types of service providers that have a portion of their offering looks a lot like this alternative cloud. And so deciding what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, or which things are going to evolve into that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, likely a lot of, you know, new usage coming in the future that'll sort of count toward this for sure, if you were to think it purely in terms of a counting exercise.
That's an interesting definitional exercise, I think, right? I mean, if you kind of take Linode, DigitalOcean, OVH, Rackspace, you can still say there's a difference between that category of provider and, you know, I'm not picking on a vendor, GoDaddy providing Linux hosting, right? You're not buying hosting, you're buying something bigger, better, more than hosting. So it's not, you know, Squarespace and Wix and WordPress. There's this category above that, which is not AI, machine learning, quantum computing, serverless, right? There's something in between that I think we're kind of trying to put our hands around and say there is a value to be unlocked here for the market. And I think the other part of that is that APIs may be kind of a definitional barrier there, right? Where you're not really using APIs in a WordPress or GoDaddy or hosted service type environment necessarily, where you might be in a DigitalOcean or Rackspace or Linode environment, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned GoDaddy, because I mean, GoDaddy has also obviously evolved quite a lot in the last few years. They look a lot more like a software company than they did a few years ago, right? But there once upon a time, and I mean, I'm saying once upon a time, it probably was like 3 or 4 years ago. They did have a product that it was called GoDaddy Cloud that looked a lot like, you know, DigitalOcean, Linode kind of thing. And I think they shelved it because and so part of the question that we're looking at here is, you know, is this a good fit for the portfolio of a larger company, or is it something that requires a sort of specialist doing this and mostly only this?
Where the vendor itself is the expert in the area and it's not something that's a part of a larger portfolio, right?
Yeah.
KellyAnn, can you talk that at all?
Yeah, and I think the comparison to especially the kind of back in the days version of GoDaddy is interesting, because what what I've liked watching is how the different pieces that are offered by what we're kind of calling alternative cloud has evolved. DigitalOcean recently announced a PaaS, right? Platform as a service offering. And there's another interesting saying I've been hearing is PaaS is dead, long live the PaaS, right? That's one of those things that kind of keeps going away, and then we kind of bring it back. And to your earlier point, Eric, about like APIs, can you imagine putting a developer in front of an option, a kind of public cloud option where there was no API for them to use, right? That is a deal breaker for most developers, even if it hasn't got, the necessity of an API hasn't gotten into the minds of the people who are kind of higher up in an organization. The people that they turn to, if they are not as kind of tactically aware as developers, the people they turn to into their organization to help them make those decisions, they certainly are aware that's almost like table stakes at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially when it comes to the developers side, right? I mean, developers they want open API specifications, they want reactive frameworks, they want, CNCF stuff, they want open standards at a bare minimum, so they're not working within proprietary APIs, because at the end of the day, the proprietary API creates technical debt for them that, cascades forward into the future, making their life more complex. So from a developer standpoint, I assume as they look at alternative cloud, they run from a baseline of open standards at a bare, if not open source, open standards, right?
And I think it's not only just the kind of fear of technical debt and the idea of having to custom write things to deal with stuff. There's also this idea of portability, which is, I don't know if it actually happens in practice as much as it does as we think it is. But the idea of, if it's not, this cloud isn't working out, I can go and I can take my code and I can easily move it, to another one if I need to, which is not necessarily always front of mind for developers, but it's not always kind of necessarily gone. And when they are talking to people who are higher up in their organization, they care very much about the idea of portability, especially when they're, considering how they're going to negotiate their kind of pricing with their different kind of cloud vendors that they have.
Yeah, to the portability point. So it's kind of right. It's I think a running joke that developers are commitment phobes around the idea of, having stuff and portability. But, longer term, I don't think it's that necessarily a joking matter. If you look at some of, for instance, the financial services companies, where the infrastructure becomes this legacy infrastructure built over time, and there are code bases living inside of credit card companies and banks that no one who works there has any idea about. Much less wants to touch it, right? So, portability becomes something I think that has come to front of mind for people as they think about legacy going forward, chaos engineering, all those kinds of things, and probably highlights how the alternative cloud category becomes important to them as they look at, multi-cloud testing environments, developer projects inside of companies, that kind of stuff. Either one of you want to speak to that? Let's see who goes first.
After you, Liam.
I would say this kind of the thing that was kind of bubbling up in my mind while you were talking, that was something that I kind of wanted to mention earlier, which was it's interesting when KellyAnn was talking through her sort of presentation and talking about how sort of developers are able to do that. Sort of bottom-up consumption or bottom-up selection of services and to, take their credit card and go make choices about what kinds of IT services a business is consuming. I do a lot of surveying and just having discussions with the sort of the IT organizations of those businesses, and they don't necessarily view that as a great way to operate, right? But what I do hear is that, whether or not they want developers to be empowered to make all the technology decisions for a business, they understand that the input of those developers is kind of the essential to making the right decision. If they have to understand that ultimately within the organization, the developer is the consumer of that resource, right? They need to make decisions based on what's going to be useful for the developers. So I don't think that maybe didn't answer your question directly, but I think it sort of speaks to the usefulness of something that appeals directly to what developers are desiring within a business, right?
Yeah, I think so, right? And I'll turn this over to you, KellyAnn, here. The developer productivity phrase is interesting to me because productivity in an organizational sense is not how developers think of productivity, right? Developers are inherently burst workers, right? They work in spurts. They copy and paste. They look for shortcuts. They try to hack their way around obstacles in front of them. Whereas organizational managers think of productivity as, did I get 7.5 hours out of that person that day, right? Developers aren't working in that cycle. So,
or how many lines of code did I get out of that developer that day?
Did they generate 10,000 lines of code today is kind of ridiculous, because if they generate 10,000 lines of bad code, then you're no better off. So anyway, so KellyAnn, if you could speak to that a little bit, I guess.
Kind of going to developer productivity, one thing I kind of do want to touch on is that developer-led adoption, the way it should probably not go is that developers are making all the purchasing decisions, because in the same way that developers want to use whatever is most expedient for them, and often that's how they end up on cloud because they can get what they want when they need it. They often don't want to worry about things like, say security or testing, right? The developers are notorious for okay, this works, let's just ship it.
Yep.
So there certainly needs to be certain levels of, say governance and policy within an organization to make sure that developers have a certain amount of say, but at the same time, there's enough kind of guardrails out there that the developers are not just kind of making whatever happens to be the quickest, most easiest decision for, say, them or their teams, and it affects the organization in some kind of negative way. So I'd say that's a kind of important ingredient to developer productivity, is that there needs to be a balance between here's what developers want to use and what is useful for developers to use, but also how do we take away the going back to the Cheesecake Factory menu level of options. You don't want developers to have that every time that they have to go make some type of decision of what they're using within an organization. So the kind of combination of input from the people who are using these, kind of tools and technologies, and then kind of guidance in terms of here's what we should maybe be letting them use. And I think that's a tough balance to achieve.
Yeah. Agreed.
I also kind of wanted to I wanted to think about, because I feel like a lot of the stuff that we've been saying, it can kind of be interpreted as almost implying that the hyperscale the hyperscale version is not the right choice ever, and I think it just probably should go without saying that there are many use cases for which those are awesome tools, right? And that's why I think the interesting thing, and I kind of brought this up toward the end of what I was talking about, was I think there's probably, and KellyAnn, to your point, is sort of a an internal menu of different possible options that includes both the hyperscaler and the alternative cloud, right? If I want to sort of sandbox something quickly and have easy access to something that I can spin up quickly and it's cheap and it's working right away, then yeah, it's probably very beneficial for an organization to arrange for their developers to have access to something like that, like the alternative as well.
That's a great point, right? So there's a mix of features, benefits, price, performance, on-ramp that every project or initiative could specifically be tailored, and that could be a hyperscaler, it could be an alternative cloud provider.
Yeah, and to my mind, alternative cloud providers, I think in order to really kind of make friends with their kind of potential customers, need to be very clear about when are they the right option for for a given organization and the developers in them, or an individual developer, and when are they not. That's something that as an industry we don't like to do, especially from the kind of marketing sides of things. But for an alternative cloud provider, I think that type of clarity could be yet another really great feature.
Clarity
from an analyst perspective, my answer to that is almost always, it depends.
Right, it's not a shopping list, but it is certainly not a Cheesecake Factory list either, right? So there's kind of an in-between of the ability to say, if you're looking for X, Y, and Z, you might want to consider 1, 2, and 3.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So as we wrap this here today, so that we don't turn this into a 4.5-hour webinar as everyone's trying to watch, just a quick closing thought on where you think the alternative cloud provider market segment kind of moves over the next 6, 12, 18 months. Liam, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So I guess there's probably two questions there, right? One is like, how will it move as sort of a market or as a sort of a part of the overall cloud market? I wouldn't expect it to sort of take over more of the cloud market, but I would expect the portion of the cloud market that's served by companies that are not the hyperscalers, will persist and will, in many cases, be happy to capture the portion of the market that they capture. And that market, of course, is growing pretty quickly, even in spite of the sort of crazy conditions that we are currently in. We see the sort of pandemic and the demands that it's placing on businesses driving a lot of almost acting as a catalyst for accelerating cloud adoption for a lot of businesses. And then the other thing I'd see is that I think we'll see the requirements for what it takes to be that sort of credible alternative cloud continue to accelerate, right? You'll continue to see, like KellyAnn, you mentioned the sort of, the launch of a PaaS or the launch of more sort of cloud native platform functions being managed by the platform, and sort of the bar for what's a good product will continue to evolve at a pretty quick pace, not 17,000 new releases at a conference each year pace, but new features coming out all the time is going to keep moving the bar for what qualifies.
Yeah, I'm so old I can remember when we used to go to conferences, right? Remember those? They were fun.
That was 100 years ago. That was before all our times.
So KellyAnn, same question to you, but from a developer angle. I mean, how do you think this evolves for the developer over the coming 6, 12, or 18 months?
I'm going to steal an answer from Liam and say it depends. And I think it depends very, very much on what, a given what we're calling alternative cloud provider, provides and kind of has on offer, to developers. I will say that I agree that the market for cloud is growing, and the number of developers is growing, and we need it to grow even faster. So there's going to be even more developers out there for whose attention everyone is kind of competing. And I think the more attention that alternative cloud providers pay to what developers want and need, the better position they're going to be in the next year and a half. Wonderful.
All right, thank you to both. Thank you, KellyAnn. Thank you, Liam. It's been informative and fun and a good discussion. Everybody stay safe out there, and we'll see you around the block here at some point in the relatively near future, we hope.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks all.